profound. I just want to digress a little bit, but to touch on the role of the movement as being formulated out of the trauma and tragedies of Black women trans activists, because as an organization, and my staff, my team know this, we never talk about this work without paying homage to the progenitors of the work. And I remember when we first developed the framework and did a beautiful presentation to our board, our governance board, our board co-chair, Dr. Tokwe Adefarakan. We've been talking about how, restorative justice, indigenous ways of knowing, we don't want to culturally appropriate indigenous ways. And then Tokwe said, yeah, but neither do we want to appropriate transformative justice, which is about, by, and for Black women, Black people embedded in their work. So Marlihan, do you want to talk a little bit about that origin story and how important it is to center Black women, trans activists, individuals who actually created this, in the effort to not have it whitewashed, and that was the word that Dalia used, have it whitewashed, or you and I talked about this, professionalized?
So any Black woman working within the anti-violence movement or the feminist movement has seen time and time again how we whitewash and depoliticize concepts that, and not just concepts, but practices that were founded by Black women. And so if you think about, for example, intersectionality, how that has been depoliticized to be like equivalent to just talking about diversity and not really analyzing the power dynamics that are central. My fear would be that we do the same thing with transformative justice, and that transformative justice becomes another buzzword like intersectionality that's, adopted by the anti-violence movement, but not really put into practice. And there's also the aspect of professionalization. We know that unfortunately, the anti-violence movement faces depoliticization and is every day moving closer and closer to the state and to depending on state responses to addressing harm. And so what happens with the appropriation of TJ or transformative justice within these spaces, my fear is that we'll be practicing TJ without the people that birthed this practice. So without Black folks, without the people that are most harmed by the criminal legal system. And so I think Felix raised the issue of practicing TJ within a nonprofit sector. And so I guess we need to address, if we know that TJ, something that is necessary for one to practice TJ is community, how do we do this in the context of a nonprofit industrial complex? Is there really a way to practice TJ in its original form, being respecting the values and the principles behind it? That's a question that I'm really interested in hearing others answer.
Let's pose it to others. Dalia, what do you think?
I will first just say that, I don't have the answer, and I feel like we're just trying to clock it as in live time every day. I think one of the first ways that we did it, and I see one of Asia's questions, this might answer it, but we chose to have our kind of pilot program, so the work that we're doing on the ground with folks, funded through a foundation as opposed to a government. And that was really intentional, who we were going to seek to fund. And so we have a local foundation that is funding this work. And part of that felt aligned because it didn't rely on the state to fund the money. And of course, philanthropists that have enough money to donate to foundations, we can go, I mean, capitalism is dirty. It's causing all of us a whole lot of grief. But how we navigate those things we felt was really important. And this particular foundation really just has aligned its practices around reporting and all of those pieces to be about organizations being trusted to do the work that they've invested in. And they actually just want you to spend the money in the ways that your work requires you to spend it, and then kind of circle back to them and let them know the great work that's been done. So that was one of our intentional pieces. I feel like it also has kind of employment practices attached to it. So the folks that we are employing into the program, we're doing really intentionally, and we're really creating the space and being intentional about who we hire into the program to be the staff working it. And then who we're triaging to have access to the programming is another big piece. So we are ensuring that the folks that get intaked into being one of the 5 cases that we said that we will do are going to be folks from racialized communities that are Black, that are Indigenous, that are from queer and trans community. And we are, we're being really clear about that. I think the other 2 pieces that we've kind of centered is that we're not going to step away from people when funding ends, that this isn't really about the funding. This is about organizationally that we are investing in this work, and that we know that TJ can sometimes take 5-10 years. And so we're along for the long haul. And then I think the other piece is just making sure that we're thinking strategically about how we wrap everybody in the care that they require, and that we're being courageous and brave to step into places where organizations might have thought it was too much of a liability or out of our scope, quote unquote. Really seeing TJ as not just a process that's between 2 people or a group of people that have been harmed, but like all of the other pieces that have created the grounds for that harm to happen. And so really thinking about community and tapping into community and ensuring that we're hearing from folks about how they feel we can be useful in contributing to conversations within community. And so right now that's where we're at.
I'm really glad that you brought Asia Mason, another girl crush. Hi, Asia, in the Yukon. Asia asked a question. In the Yukon, one of the biggest barriers in realizing restorative justice in communities relates to the financial and administrative constraints associated with the facilitation of these processes. If we recognize that the nonprofit industrial complex dilutes movements, and that the public sector, i.e. governments, are themselves arms of the criminal justice system, how can we support communities to find money to facilitate TJ and RJ frameworks? I just want to start off a little bit of what we do. Is we're spending a lot of our time educating our funders. And to your point, Dalia, about funders who give you the money and there are no strings attached. We know the government always has strings, but we are gently walking with them to help them break those strings, right? Cut those strings for them to understand that the funds that we need cannot fit nicely into this box. It cannot do the type of stuff that you want to do. And I look at it that the money from government is mine, right? We're taxpayers. So it's actually taxpayers' money that is being returned to us, the community, to do work that is useful. But I'd like to hear from Jeff a little bit of away from money and stuff, but more around sort of other barriers, right? What other barriers do you see or have you experienced in the work, in your work of transformative justice, apart from money?
Well, one of them, I don't know, that comes to mind, I don't know if it's the one you're thinking of, Neka, but it was flagged in the chat already, is and I think this is relevant to the community context too, that Marliane was saying. If people aren't in a community where there's a general understanding, like we don't go to the police, that's not a part of it. I mean, that's my understanding, and I may be wrong, but in certain contexts, why these processes began to develop. And the reality is, when we're outside of, if I'm outside of that community and someone approaches me and says, you assaulted me, you sexually assaulted me, or whatever it is, the fear is that if I go out and I want to take responsibility for that, the fear is that if I, in the strict legal language, if I confess, right, if I admit that I did something wrong, that's admissible against me in a court, either in a civil court in the context of a lawsuit or in a criminal court in the context of a criminal case. And so the fact that that system is out there, those systems are out there, I think they have a chilling effect on people being willing to take accountability in the way that we're talking about here, in terms of potentially listening or sort of responding to what the needs are of the person who survived the harm, which might be sitting and hearing right from them directly, this is the harm you caused, and be able to answer questions. Why did you do this? Why me? What's going on in your life? What are the underlying issues that caused this? All those things that can happen in these kinds of processes. So, the conservative criminal lawyer advice is always never make a statement. 100%. Never make a statement. Never make a statement until you are on the stand testifying in your own defense at a trial. Because if you start making other statements, and certainly if you confess things, well, then you're setting yourself up for failure. And so one of the things from a kind of, I don't know if it's like a nerdy or like technical legal perspective, is that there are these concepts out there called settlement privilege, mediation privilege, where what happens in one process with just some, I don't want to, nothing is going to be 100% foolproof, but with some protections can be built in that says, a statement made in this context can't be used in a court. It's privileged. It's given a special privilege. So that's something that I've looked into a little bit. So that's one, but just that sort of general fear. Beyond the like social fear of admitting the shame and all those pieces, then there's the fear of like jail time, of lawsuit damages. And then the other piece is that a lot of people enter the people who do pick up the phone, like survivors, and call the police and then enter the system. Right now, the Ministry of the Attorney General in Ontario has a policy that says sexual assault cases can't be diverted to community justice programs. I could say more about that in another moment, but right now the general policy in the Ministry of the Attorney General is opposed to doing anything under whatever label that is oriented to the same underlying values that we're talking about here, a different kind of accountability and healing.
I just want to follow up on that, Jeff. What are the ways that we can disrupt that notion that the only way to address sexual violence is through criminal legal system? How can we get involved in advocacy with the Ministry of the Attorney General, as an example? Your opinion as a lawyer.
That it's
Great
not,
question.
I've talked to you, way more than I do. I've been, in this very particular role in the system. I won't pretend to have dabbled in the policy side of things.
Well, that's work to be done. Work to be done. So, Rachel, well, I was asking Jeff about barriers that he foresees. Can you share some of the successes, what is it, that you've experienced in your work around transformative justice?
Oh, child, I was preparing to answer the barriers question.
Well, you know what? Go for it. Let's start with that. Go for the barriers question.
I want to just respond to something Jeff said, though, because I was thinking, I don't know, I hadn't thought about this until now, but, Robert Wright has pioneered IRCAs, the Impact, Race, and Cultural Assessments, and they've been used primarily in murder cases. Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong. And they've been used successfully in a number of cases here, the latest being the Anderson case, which was from December or January last fall. But, they are created, it was created in mind with the Gladue report as an assessment that could, in the case of, I mean, rapes most often happen in the context of familiarity and with Black folks among Black folks. So I was thinking, you know, in the instance of, you know, a community case of rape, you know, an impact race cultural assessment could be used to sort of create mitigating circumstances, right? I guess it wouldn't take, you know, a sexual assault case out of the hand, like out of court completely, but there has to be some way that it could be used in the way that we would want it to be used, you know, in the context of transformative justice. So I was just thinking Robert Wright would be a really great person to talk to about that. You just got my brain going. So I have to speak to barriers because that's just on my heart. I can definitely speak to successes. Barriers, we are our greatest barrier. And I am speaking to Black people. So I'm talking about us. We are our greatest. That's who I know best. That's who I give my energy and time to. My children are Black. I am Black. We are our greatest barrier. And, you know, there's a case here involving a man named Brian Johnston. It's so crazy. In December, a woman filed a complaint. She named Brian Johnston, remember that, it's S-T-O-N, as her abuser. He was a former RCMP officer, now a Baptist minister in our area, who had the responsibility of, you know, serving on the juvenile task force in the 80s and 90s, and was just raping young women in the Halifax region, and was protected by all of his more senior officers in the RCMP, as we know. Let me just say alleged, because the lawsuit is proceeding as we speak. But here's the crazy thing, you know, I read the lawsuit and said, wow, you know, there's this opportunity to use this beautiful documentary that was created here. It's called No More Secrets. I've never seen another film like it. It was created by Sylvia Hamilton, very hard to find. Dr. Sylvia Hamilton has not digitized it yet. And it's Black women in our community here in the Halifax area, talking about elderly Black women, talking about being beaten by their husbands, abused by their partners, and telling their stories in a talking circle, naming names. We don't have that, right? And the second part of that documentary is, you know, the role of the church, a number of prominent Baptist ministers here. I realized just this weekend that, you know, Brian Johnston is featured in 1999 in the second part of this documentary. And his role in this documentary, I don't think he'd retired from the RCMP then, was talking about, you know, how he supports men who do harm and how he wants to transform the way that, you know, men think and behave. And he's had to learn about the impact of gender-based violence in our communities. Now, this is just one example. And it's just on my heart this morning because I just had a conversation with Dr. Sylvia Hamilton about potentially using the film, and then realized this connection, like, oh my God, our biggest problem is ourselves. We cannot, I have come to believe wholeheartedly that we cannot undertake transformative justice work unless we are bringing community along with us. And I mean, our church is our elders, and struggling with our elders. There's going to be struggle there inevitably, right? Because the instinct in many of our people is that, well, you're just harming Black men and good Black men by trying to engage in transformative justice work. So, you know, the greatest barrier is us. And so, okay, let me stop there. Let me say something good. Let me say something good. I had the most incredible transformative justice accountability process that ended last year. I blogged about it on our Third Eye website. It was incredible. And it was incredible probably because the creator was like, bitch, you finally deserve a win after almost a decade. Like, damn, you fucked up so much. You got some basic skills down. Like all the stars align, like getting pregnant, right? Like all the stars have to align. No, I'm being facetious, but here's the things that were really right from the beginning. I was asked to do it. I was like, I don't have the capacity to do it alone, but let's find a team. Found a great team. We were really clear, boom, about our boundaries and needs up front. Super clear, held and honored those boundaries. There was lots of chat in the community about how harmful this person had been, because he is a well-known organizer in our community. So before we even got started, I just picked up the phone and started having calls with people. This is not your business. How can I help you understand what's going on here? Stop talking about this stuff. Like, the person who's been harmed and the person who has harmed agree. They want to work on this. This is none of your business, right? So like, it was really, really important before we started to like kill the noise in the community, right? And just have conversations, but also set really clear boundaries, really clear boundaries with people who, wanted to say something, that believed he should be kicked out of this space and kicked out of that space. It's the person who's harmed who gets to decide what they want in this circumstance. I should have started with this. There was real clarity from both people about what they wanted out of the process. And that, I think, is a very rare thing, to have someone who's been harmed say, I'm super pissed off and I don't want more harm to happen. Here's exactly what I want him to do over a year with you all. We could hold on for a whole year, our little hub. All the conditions were just like, right. And what was also right is that I had messed up enough, had to make amends for stuff that I messed up. I had put in my work. I had just come out of, I think, my 3rd training with generative somatics. I'm so far from perfect, but I had like, I felt like I understood what embodiment was for the first time in my life, I felt like I had the tools, in that beautiful handbook that Mariam Kaba and Shira Hassan have given us. There's like this checklist in the beginning. And one of the things on the checklist is like, what's happening with you? Are you here with an intention or desire to harm or like punish this person? And no one in our little hub holding this process had that. None of us did. In fact, there were organizers who were way more seasoned than I was, who participated in that process. Anyway, it was beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful, and it restored my whole faith in the possibility of actually doing community accountability processes. It restored my faith in that. But yeah, there were some stars aligned, but I had also done enough work on me to be ready. That's real. That's real.
I love that. I saw the other panelists nodding in agreement about doing work on themselves. Mindful of the time, I have one question for you, and then I know there are some questions in the chats that I'd rather either ask the person that's posed it to unmute themselves and ask, or I can read it out. But my last formal question to each of you, and I'll start with you, Marlianne, is where do you want to go from here? Where do you see us going from here as a movement?
So I also want to share one of success.
Bring it.
I think it's important. I think it's important a lot of times, especially within the anti-violence movement, when you talk about transformative justice, restorative justice, people just discard everything you say because it's too idealistic. It's never going to work.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I've also experienced a bit of I'm very excited in terms of the work some of the work that's being done here in Montreal. So outside my work at the coalition, I worked alongside other Black feminists in developing resources for Black survivors here in Montreal, especially in neighborhoods facing state neglect and violence like Montreal North. I continued this work after I left the coalition, and I'm currently participating in a project in Montreal North to bring prevention and support services to the community that's founded on principles of reparation and transformative justice. And I get to work alongside Black and racialized youth in exploring transformative justice and community accountability as an alternative means to violence intervention and prevention. And so we're currently developing transformative prevention programming with youth in Montreal North that engages them in social analysis and a critique of power and community education regarding the dynamics of violence and accountability and the understandings of trauma and healing. And so the youth are working collectively in developing prevention strategies that address the social conditions that perpetuate gender-based violence within their community, and that address the disinvestment in marginalized urban neighborhoods specifically. And so this is something that I'm very hopeful and excited about. And hopefully we can continue doing this work, and hopefully we can continue growing and learning from this work. And in terms of, what was your question, Nick?
Where next? What do you want to see happen next?
There's a quote from Aurora Levins Morales. I don't know if y'all know this organizer, but they say, in order to build the movements capable of transforming our world, we have to do our best to live with one foot in the world we have not yet created. So I think something that's important is acknowledging that we don't have the answers. We don't have all the answers, and this work is messy, and we're gonna make mistakes, and we're gonna learn from our mistakes. And we need to have the empathy and the love to be able to hold space to grow. And so there's a lot of challenges ahead. I'm really grateful that these conversations are, that we're carving space to have these conversations. For me, there's hope, but there's also frustration, because in Quebec, there's really little space, if not none, in the anti-violence movement to have these conversations. I'm hopeful that as a movement, we move away from carceral logics that reinforce violence. And the anti-violence movement was originally a grassroots movement that resisted, state responses, state violence. And so my fear is that we continue to move closer to the arms of the state and not further away from it. And I see this right now, like in the context of Quebec, where, in the fight against gender-based violence, the government has just decided to continue investing in policing, creating task force to address domestic violence, and little investment in terms of prevention. When I say prevention, I mean prevention, not like police officers going into schools to talk about healthy relationships, but prevention and addressing the root causes of violence per se. And so, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I love that. I'm glad you pushed back to say, I actually have a success. So I'm actually going to open it to everybody, to now you, Dahlia, and to Jeff. What are the successes that you'd like to share? Jeff, do you want to start?
I already referenced it, and I saw Kara Sweeney in the chat, who was the prosecutor involved in that case. But that experience that I was very honored to have been able to participate in, where Kara, as the prosecutor, because of the role of a public prosecution, was able to basically give us permission to do this process that was run by St. Stephen's Community House, a circle process with my client Marley, her mother, her sister, myself, Kara, the aggressor, and his best friend. there's a whole bunch of lead up steps to it in terms of him having to do counseling, similar kinds of steps that are what Allison was talking about earlier and Nikki were talking about. Marley had done an incredible amount of work on herself. And then we ultimately had an 8-hour circle process. And it felt like there was so much healing happening in that. It was very intense. But the kind of personal, interpersonal, and systemic healing, it just felt like these like huge forces like moving through this room. And the next time I walked back into Superior Court here in Toronto, it felt like going from a full multicolor like world to black and white, where there's right versus wrong, there's binaries, there's us versus them, disconnect, dehumanization. Marley referred to this process as rehumanization. I think in the act of both being harmed and causing harm, there's dehumanization that happens. And so I don't know, there's almost like an energy of, well, we have to resolve this. We have to continue this energy of dehumanizing and dehumanizing and dehumanizing, which is what I think the criminal legal system does to everybody who touches it, and jails do as well. And so that it felt, yeah, it was a transformative experience to be a part of, also gave me hope. And I think the more that these kinds of processes can happen, I don't like outside the system, outside the state system, the more there might be able to be a shift. I know my very general sense of what happened in New Zealand in terms of at least my sense is they're more ahead in terms of, I mean, again, there's all kinds of problems that can come with institutionalizing things, as Marlianne was mentioning and others have mentioned, but a lot of people, in terms of access, like people, I think, will continue to pick up the phone and engage the state in whatever way through whatever means, and the more that can be happening there, the better, as well as building things outside. But that in New Zealand, my understanding was that the gender-based violence movement had a shift towards being more in favor of these kinds of processes, and once that happened, there was more political willingness to shift as well. So I really commend all the work that everybody's doing in that way.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. Dahlia, over to you. Last words around successes.
So I feel like my heart and brain is really at a systemic level still. I feel like I've been gathering our people for a while here in BC, because when I kind of entered the movement in the late 90s and early 2000s, at that time, there was a real desire to continue to try to get gender-based violence seen as something that was important and that needed to be picked up and seen for its harm. And so there was a real sense that the responses that we were trying to, as an anti-violence movement, succeed with were really so rooted in this hustle for worthiness. And that somehow the unintended consequences that we relied on the state that is formed on the doctrine of discovery and this idea that domination is the only way to prove worthiness. And I don't know how I don't know how the white women missed that as we built this movement that has now become professionalized. And so for me, what I've been doing kind of along the way, really intentionally since 2017, 2018, is really asking people who are within these systems, so defense lawyers and Crown, anti-violence workers, just like similar to what Rachel was saying, like, how do we do the work to think about how we've also, because many of us are survivors that are called to do this work, how have we also been harmed by reinvesting, being pushed and influenced to reinvest in these systems that we know are not working. And I feel like that's been a really relational process here in BC, because we've actually had a moratorium, similar to the way that Ontario says you can't divert cases. We've had a moratorium on anything other than prosecution around gender-based violence that invites the state in. And of course, we know through that attrition pyramid, like there's a whole track of folks that aren't even considering calling for all of the reasons that we know also. So I just find like we're in this really interesting place, and this is why I'm really excited about the national work that we're gonna get to host and collect people again to like really try to change this conversation around how do we continue to acknowledge that gender-based violence and sexual violence really is serious and really does, like, we're constantly trying to hold people so that they can stay on this planet because of the impacts of the harm. And also see that accountability processes is not letting people off the hook or not taking it seriously, but actually, if folks can flex that muscle and have the tools to do that work, that it's actually far more, has far more long-term changes to people's behavior than putting somebody in jail. And so that's, I feel like starting to see, I remember Nneka, when I saw your presentation for the first time on that wage webinar, and I was just like, we're not alone. Oh my God, there's other people doing it, because in BC it feels like, you know, the Western alienation thing. I won't go into that, but it feels like we're really up against folks who have been just saying for so long that like anything other than a criminal justice response is not sufficient to proving the harm that's been caused. And so I feel like that's a success, that we are all here today, that we get to do the work as parents. My son is in a school, and I also saw a question about how do we work with youth. They have a justice circle at school. And so if kids are harmed, if feelings are harmed, they can go and write a note, and they hold a justice circle every week. Like, I think it starts at every kind of level of our lives, right? As an employer, I'm also looking at like, okay, we're going to do TJ externally, but how do we bring transformative justice values into the ways that we are together as staff when conflicts and tensions and microaggressions are happening in the workplace? How do we then kind of weave those braids of TJ internally as well? So I think it's the expansive nature of all of this is really what I see as a success.
Beautiful. Absolutely, absolutely beautiful. I am mindful of the time. This has been, I honestly am shocked at how quickly this conversation, how time has flown. I want to go to the chats. Beautiful quote, Marlihan. Yes, amazing, Dahlia. Rachel, this is so perfect. This is comments from the chat. And Asia asked a question. I think we've answered one or two of them. How then do we teach model accountability taken in a way that is less tied to punishment? Anyone, like a one sentence, how do we teach accountability without Big Brother finger wagging? The one, Rachel? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I want to see the question. Maybe it would help me. It's not totally clear to me.
Okay, sorry. She says accountability taken is such an important component of TJ and RJ process. Yet within the criminal justice system or / legal framework, punishments, incarceration are all tied in with accountability. Taken together, it seems like accountability taken is not particularly safe for people who do harm. How then do we teach it and model it? And it goes a little bit to what Jeff was saying about the when you have prison looming over you, what's the likelihood that you're going to fess up and say, mea culpa, I did it? And if that's not the way the system, lends itself, what can we be doing?
So I'm gonna just start from the smallest place that I know. So when I think about, so first of all, I think of transformative justice and abolition as being locked together. And transformative justice is just the floor, right? That abolition work gets built upon. It's the floor. It has to be the floor. We haven't built the floor yet. So for me, the starting point of thinking about all this work is, what are my harmful behaviors? Because I think it was Dahlia that mentioned we all live in the circle. We all live inside the circle of patriarchy, of transphobia, of all of the isms that we claim to be fighting against. They live inside of us as well. They live and breathe inside of us. So what are my harmful behaviors? What are my trauma wounds? What are my trauma reflexes? And then what's the relationship between my trauma and how I behave in the world in my relationships? For me, that's like, you can't really talk about or think about accountability, whether it's in the abstract or in like a real practical way, until you like work through those layers. You know, I think most of us tend to want to do it backwards, and it just doesn't work. It explodes every time. So I guess when I think about accountability, it's, you know, how do we do the work? Take a step back. How do we encourage people, build a world, foster an environment where, you know, people that we're in relationship to are, you know, are in our families and our workspaces, are working on their own harmful behaviors and their own trauma? Like, how do we all like model that, but also foster that in the worlds that we inhabit, right? Because without that, the explosion will happen. I just believe very deeply every time. So then the question is, okay, so how do we like separate accountability from these other causal logics and so forth? Well, I don't think it's terribly hard, because in order to engage in like any kind of accountability work, there has to be a willingness there. I don't think you can really force people. I think you can nudge people a little bit into accountability. You can't force them. But, you know, I just want to come back to the conditions. I used to hate when Angela Davis talked about this in the 90s, because it sounded so abstract to me. But it really is about, what are the conditions that I'm building as I'm working on myself, as I'm like not beating my children and, you know, apologizing and dealing with the harm that I've done. When I'm doing all those things simultaneously, how am I also fostering the conditions that are really inviting for people to want to partake in this work? How am I modeling and like, you know, inviting people into this work? It still sounds weird and hippie and abstract, but I do believe very much that we do this work backwards. You know, we talk about transformative justice in the abstract, and then we, you know, narrow it down to this really cool acronym, but we don't talk about the embodiment of it. And what are the conditions that we're creating everywhere to make it inviting? You know, like, and Adrienne Marie Brown gave us, you know, like the idea of pleasure and activism as being really compatible. How are we like making the work of transformative justice really inviting? And by making it inviting, whereby we can actually engage in accountability, it means that we have to be holding all these other layers. It's like holding so many moving pieces at once. Yeah. And without holding one piece, like there's more tendency to tip and fail. That's why I mentioned our elders, the church, you know, those old school, like white Quebecois feminists that Marliane, God bless your heart, has to deal with. God bless you. So anyway, I know that's complex,
no, that's beautiful.
That's how I think about it.
That's very, very profound and very, very spot on. I'm going to end with one last question from one of the participants who says, I'm wondering also about disabled folks and how how they tend to get left behind in anti-violence movements, and if there's space for disabled folks in transformative justice. Maybe who wants to take this, Dahlia or Marliane? Just a quick. Either one? Anyone mindful of the time?
Well, I responded to the question. I invited I invited the person to explore maybe some of the work of Mia Mingus, because TJ does embrace frameworks that address their harm, that targets folks with disability. And we know that a lot of the folks that are criminalized are folks with disabilities or disabled folks. And so, yeah, I invited the person to maybe explore their work. I just wanted to say, just before we finish, just to answer that previous question, I think it's important that we believe that people that cause harm are capable of changing, that communities are capable of changing. Because if we don't believe that people are capable of changing, I don't think we can do this work. And also as someone who works within the anti-violence movement, I think it's important that those that do this work within this movement aspire to transform, the conditions that create violence instead of just managing the violence, because we're always reacting and involved in developing projects that just manage this violence. But like, when are we going to start investing in really eradicating it and transforming the violence? And I think that's something that's important we think about.
That is so beautiful and a really nice way to end, because when I think about our Women at the Centre's tagline that we came up with in 2008, it's been the same tagline since then, and it's transforming our lives and eradicating violence against women. Now we've moved it to transforming our lives, eradicating gender-based violence. And it is about hope, right? Living with hope of a world where this type of experience, this type of reaction to living is not the norm, right? It isn't a go-to. And when we use the word eradicate, it was purposeful, and how the Latin eradicare, to pull up from its roots, is what we're working to do. And the transformation that happens is not just for the individual who experienced the harm and the individual that's caused the harm. It permeates, it trickles through everybody in society. And my hope for all of you who've been doing this work is that you are supported by everybody around you, is that you feel the love that is coming from us, is that you are able to continue to impact and influence everybody that meets you, as you've impacted and influenced everybody that's been on this call. I want to say thank you so very much to you, Dr. Rachel Zellers, to you, Marlianne Lopez, to you, Dahlia Israel, and to you, Jeff Carolyn, because the work that you people are doing is what gives me personally hope. And sitting around in a community with you and having these conversations is part of the reason why I get up in the morning. I want to say a real thank you to my team who put all this thing together. Kelsey, who's not with us today because she is sick, sending her love. To our placement students, to all the staff. This has been a beautiful minute. And I see Michelle Rolfe is on the call as well. Thank you all so very much. Sending you love and light in sisterhood. Have a wonderful rest of the week and stay strong, stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye.